Hello, I'm Patricia Van Skyke, Director of the Lloyd Library and Museum in Cincinnati, Ohio. I'd like to welcome you to today's program, Our Lifelong Relationship with Fungi, the Human Mycobiome Near and Far. The Lloyd Library was founded more than 140 years ago by three brothers who manufactured nature-based medicine. To support their research, they collected books and specimens about plants and nature. One of our founders, Curtis Gates Lloyd, was a leading mycologist at the turn of the 20th century, publishing works on the subject, acquiring books on mushrooms dating back to the 1600s, and corresponding with mycologists from around the world. Today, our understanding of fungi continues to grow, and mycology is gaining center stage in fields ranging from medicine to the environment. This program was offered in conjunction with an exhibition at the Lloyd Library, A Foray into Fungi, showcasing the Lloyd's extensive scientific and beautifully illustrated resources on the subject. Our presenter, Dr. Nick Money, is a professor of biology at Miami University in Oxford, Ohio, and director of the Western program. An expert on fungal biology, he has authored a dozen popular science books that celebrate the microbial world. Please join me in welcoming Professor Nick Money as he leads us on a journey exploring the enormous scope and impact of fungi.
Thank you. Thanks for coming. So, I'm going to talk about a few of the items in the exhibition, beginning with this one. This is the frontispiece from one of the volumes that was published in the 1860s by a pair of Catholic brothers, the Tulane brothers, Louis René and Charles Tulane. And in this frontispiece, in this diagram here, it looks like we're looking at a volcanic scene. You see there in the center there's a smoking volcano. But in fact, if you look more closely, and one of the volumes of the original is in the case over here, that thing in the middle that's a volcano is actually a microscopic fruit body of a fungus, and that smoke that's arising from the fruit body is actually a smoke of spores. And then the surrounding vegetation, again, if you look closely, these are microscopic spore-producing structures, and there's a thing called a powdery mildew there. These gentlemen were obsessed with the fungi, almost as much as I've been throughout my adult life. And I translated from the Latin here. This is from the book of Daniel, one of the more apocalyptic books in the Hebrew Bible. All ye works of the Lord, bless the Lord, praise and exalt him forever. And they use this kind of language throughout their work, the Selecta Carpologia Fungorum, and they say that they're exploring the microscopic world for the glory of God. This was the impetus for their work, but I think they got drawn into the sheer beauty of the fungi. And I'm going to show you hopefully some beautiful images this evening and talk about our relationship with the fungi. So I'm going to talk about the human mycobiome, and I'll define what that is shortly. So near in terms of a very intimate relationship, the fungi that grow on and in our tissues. And then I'm going to extend that picture and look at the way that we interact with fungi, and we have interacted with fungi throughout history. And this is my brief from John Milton's Paradise Lost, the greatest poem in the English language. If you haven't read it, you should read it. And I've made a couple of amendations to this early verse in Paradise Lost, the ones in italics, if you can read them. And so Milton obviously ended this and justify the ways of God to men. And I don't have enough hubris to do that, but I'm going to justify the ways of mushrooms to humans. Sing, heavenly muse. What in them is dark, illumine. What is low, raise and support, that to the height of this great argument I may assert eternal providence and justify the ways of mushrooms to men. So a fairly modest goal for a 50-minute presentation. All right. I'm going to talk about mushrooms. This comes from one of the most glorious books in the exhibition here at the Lloyd, from Bulliard's study of French mushrooms, and it's down here. And I'm going to be talking about mushrooms, but before I get there, I want to talk about the fungi that grow on the body, and that means that I need to discuss yeasts, microscopic yeasts that grow on all of us and in all of us in probably ways that you're not aware. They reproduce by forming buds on their surface, so the mother cell sheds baby yeasts in the form of buds. And then I want to talk about molds that grow in the form of these filamentous colonies of filamentous hyphae, microscopic filaments that extend in all directions. And so these are the microfungi that I'll be talking about for the first half, and then I'll be moving into the mushrooms to give you this fulsome picture of our relationship with the mycological world. Speaking of which, mycobiome. You've all heard about the microbiome. There's been a lot of research on the microbiome, trillions of bacteria that teem in our digestive system over the last 25 years. But until recently, there hasn't been a lot of work on the fungal component of this ecosystem in our bodies. So while there are trillions of bacteria in our guts and in your gut working right now, digesting our food, doing all kinds of things, there are tens of billions of fungal cells. And I want to explain why this is really cutting edge science. This is relatively new stuff that's come about through the use of new genetic techniques, new molecular genetic techniques. So the microbiome is the fungal component of the microbiome. And there's a ridiculous Wikipedia entry if you look up microbiome, and it says that there are tens of billions of fungal cells in the body, trillions of bacteria. So it's maybe 100 or 1,000-fold difference in numbers. The fungi can't be that important to human health. However, fungal cells are huge compared with bacteria. And if we took all of the fungal cells in the human body and we spread them out to look at their total surface area, it would match the surface area of an 8-person dining room table. That is a massive amount of surface area for chemistry. It's a huge area for interactions with our immune system. So we're just beginning to understand maybe how our bodies have worked with these invisible microorganisms and do so throughout our lives, which is where I begin. So we're exposed to fungi before we're born. The amniotic fluid, at least when I studied anatomy many years ago, was seen as this sterile fluid in the ideal situation, right, in a healthy, for the developing fetus. But in fact, it contains microorganisms. We know also that the fetus develops a swallowing reflex, and that we swallow amniotic fluid as we develop. If we look at the first poop that comes from a baby, called the Mycobiome, which we expel in the first couple of days of life, tarry substance, we find, using molecular genetic techniques, that there are traces of a lot of yeast cells in there. This means that even in the womb, we're beginning to interact with the fungal world. Now, we don't know whether the cells that are in the amniotic sac, the fungal cells, are active, or whether these are just traces of this material, but we know that our immune system is interacting with fungi, is being primed for a lifetime of exposure to fungi before we're born. When we're born, if we're born vaginally, we're coated with yeasts from the vagina. If not, we acquire a lot of different fungi from skin to skin contact, and throughout life, we're exchanging fungi whenever we make physical contact with another member of our species. But it's important to realize that these early interactions are very significant, that we're beginning to form this relationship with the fungi, because as soon as we're born, we're inundated with microorganisms. This, let the battle begin. And yeah, I think there's somebody. hundreds of people outside trying to get it. They couldn't get a ticket. So yeah, we're primed for these interactions very, very early on. I'm going to tell you what, nine stories. Some of them will last longer than others, and I'll refer to different parts of the body to do so. I'm going to begin with the skin, and I mustn't go too far on this digression. Now, Iris Murdoch said this was the greatest poem. That's Milton's Paradise Lost. Iris Murdoch said that this was the greatest painting in European art. It's Titian's Flaying of Messias, and if you ever get a chance to see it, it's overwhelming. It's in a private collection. It sometimes is seen in exhibitions. It's horrific. It's Titian's view of a story from Ovid about poor Messias. It's a bit like the devil came down to Georgia. So Messias engaged in this musical contest with Apollo, and he lost the contest. And Apollo said, well, your punishment is we're going to hang you from a tree and flay you alive. So why have I got this here? I've got this here because Messias at this point, Marcius, is very aware of his skin. Painfully, horrifically aware of his skin. When our skin works well, we're not aware of it. We don't think about the largest organ on the human body until it becomes inflamed. And part of that inflammatory process is driven by our interactions with fungi. So we can start with a relatively minor condition like sensitive skin syndrome that, according to some surveys, affects more than half of all humans. And it's a mild inflammatory condition, causes blotching of the skin. You often see it on the face, and it can be exacerbated by the use of different cosmetic products. And in studies from South Korea, South Koreans are quite interested in cosmetics, as you may know. They found that the skin of patients that were suffering from sensitive skin syndrome was covered with different kinds of fungi than we find on patients that weren't affected by sensitive skin syndrome. So it's a subtle change in the ecology of the skin related to this process. We can take that further to erythema, so reddening of the skin, real inflammation that many of us have encountered at sometimes suffered from, perhaps big changes in the fungi on the skin. They're there. Let's talk about ringworm. So ringworm infection, which is most prevalent in children before puberty. It's not seen so commonly today, but an infection of the scalp or elsewhere on the skin. And this is a real fungal infection. And we know, or rather the relationship between the fungi and the development of ringworm illnesses was really cracked in the 1840s by a scientist called Robert Remak. And I'm going to talk about 3 or 4 scientists that were guilty of self-experimentation. It's something that's not ethically, this wouldn't pass muster in sort of medical ethics, but they experimented on themselves. Robert Remak, a European, he took a skin scab from the head of a patient suffering from ringworm. He taped it onto his forearm and he left it there for days and weeks until he developed ringworm on his arm, and he looked under a microscope to check that, to find, and indeed found that the ringworm fungus was there causing this condition. He essentially, this was his version of the germ theory 20 years before Pasteur, much better known than Robert Remak, was celebrated for showing this relationship between microorganisms and human disease. So that's the first example of experimentation on fungi and our bodies. I'll tell you about some others later on. Sticking with the skin, this shoe was found in an Armenian cave. It's dated to, it's about 5,500 years old. Wearing shoes is, we can view this as, one of the great joys of modern civilization. I probably spend more money on Zappos than I do on I don't know on what, automobiles. But wearing beautiful shoes like this comes with a price. We're enclosing the foot, the moisture increases, and we get athlete's foot that develops in the toe web. Another example of a clear instance of a fungus that's affecting our enjoyment of life. This is the fungus that causes it, trichophyton. There's actually a few fungi that cause this. What's interesting, though, is if we look at the genetics of the athlete's foot fungus, we find the highest diversity of the athlete's foot fungus on the African continent. That's where we find the highest genetic diversity among Homo sapiens. So the idea is that we evolved with, or rather, the athlete's foot fungus was part of the mycobiome for a long, long time, long before we started wearing shoes. It didn't cause any kind of problem whatsoever. It migrated with us when we left Africa, when we left the Rift Valley. And then when we began wearing shoes, we transformed this relationship into an unpleasant one where we develop athlete's foot. And if you go into Walgreens and look at just the investment in athlete's foot products, powders, creams, you name it, clearly this is an important part of modern life. It's the downside of wearing shoes. Interesting interaction there. One last fungus on the skin, but I cannot possibly give a talk in Cincinnati without talking about dandruff. This is the dandruff capital of the world. I'll tell you why shortly if you don't know. The dandruff fungus. So there are fungi, and one particular fungus thing called Malassezia that lives on the scalp and digests sebum. So sebums, if you're close enough to see, this is the waxy material that's secreted by the oil gland and weeps over the hair surface. This fungus loves this stuff and is brilliant at breaking it down. Up to 1 million yeasts can live in the area of a postage stamp on the scalp. That's a lot of yeasts. Why do we have this? Why is this of local concern? There's Malassezia on a culture plate. Bam. That's why Procter & Gamble, I'm sure there's somebody here that works for or worked for Procter & Gamble, or if not, you're heavily invested in Procter & Gamble in your retirement portfolios. Best-selling shampoo in the world, best-selling dandruff shampoo, Head and Shoulders. It contains a compound, if you look on your bottle, it'll say perithione zinc. Perithione zinc is a broad-spectrum antifungal agent. So if you use Head and Shoulders in the morning in the shower, you're actually damaging the fungi that would otherwise cause skin flaking and dandruff. I'm really interested in this stuff. I'm really interested in dandruff because there's been so much interest in the use of broad spectrum antibiotics and the treatment of bacterial complaints, infections. But there's been very, very little attention paid to the effects of broad spectrum antifungals, and they're being used everywhere. This is sort of the mildest example, but if you use dandruff shampoo, you're changing the ecology of your bathroom, probably the groundwater too. Nobody's studying this. This needs to be looked at. This is a fungistatic agent that reduces the growth of fungi. But in agriculture, we use antifungal agents in massive quantities, very, very powerful compounds. We're changing the ecology of the soil, of groundwater. We're affecting fungal populations. And there's so much interest right now in the rise of fungal infections. For example, those caused by a fungus called Candida auris. And there's a mycologist with whom I disagree. He thinks that climate change is involved in the rise of this fungus. I think it's a lot more likely it's the fact that we're making major changes in the development of these fungi by dousing them with antifungals. I'm not saying that Head and Shoulders is to blame for this, but I think it's something we should be looking at. What's the effect of changing the ecology, both of our skin, but also of the groundwater? Fascinating series of questions, I think. Lungs, move on a bit more quickly now with the other topics. Lungs, and we'll talk about asthma. So asthma, Alternaria is a fungus whose spores are present in, we're breathing them in right now. They're in every sip of air on planet Earth. They grow on plant surfaces. It's ubiquitous. And Alternaria spores carry a protein called ALT-A1. And if you take an asthmatic child, take them, come here, and you scratch their arm and you do a skin test with ALT-A1, they'll do a wheel and flare reaction. Their immune system is highly reactive to this stuff. And it works on adults with asthma too, including me. I suffer from asthma very badly as a child. Fungal spores are responsible for a lot of cases of asthma. But they're actually overlooked, surprisingly, in most of the textbooks of respiratory medicine. And also there was a book called Asthma, a biography that was written by, I can't remember the guy's first name, Jackson. So it was a whole biography of asthma, which I read as was an interesting book. He doesn't mention fungal spores. He mentions plant pollen, pet dander, but he doesn't mention fungal spores, which to me is absolutely bizarre, since globally skin tests have been performed on asthmatic children and they're highly reactive to fungal spores. So the fact that we're breathing in these spores all the time has profound effects upon our health. I mean, some estimates suggest there's maybe as many as 700 million people suffer from asthma. And it's actually, it's an increasingly asthmatic planet, and there's actually more spores in the air, which is an interesting connection. But in any case, self-experimentation, two amazing individuals that did work to actually show this connection with fungi and asthma, and actually the second example to actually treat asthma. Charles Blackley, in, I have to look down, 1870s, deliberately inhaled moldy straw until he provoked his own asthma attacks, which was a sort of almost suicidal experiment. But he did this many, many times. He wrote a book about this, and he was trying to actually understand asthma. It was considered a psychosomatic condition at that time, and still is. You still see asthma referred to as sort of a psychosomatic condition, which is sort of whenever a disease is considered idiopathic, we don't know cause and effect. You know, we'll say it's a psychiatric condition. And so Proust, the very famous asthmatic, he was considered to be a sort of a sensitive young man. You know, he's bound to be asthmatic. It's a sort of it's a badge of honor as well as a death sentence, potential death sentence. But I digress. So Blackley did this and showed this connection between mold and asthma. And then my hero in this field was a Syrian-born British investigator called Roger Altunian. And in the 1960s, he deliberately induced 3,000 asthma attacks in himself by inhaling dusts of various kinds, because he was interested in figuring out what kinds of plant products might be a useful treatment for asthma. And this library being partly a celebration of pharmacology, it's a good place to talk about Altunian's work. And he worked on, he induced 3,000 asthma attacks. He was a severe asthmatic. Sometimes he almost died. He'd have to bring himself back by sort of stabbing himself with a rescue medicine. Incredible man. But he found a compound, and that compound was called cromolyn sodium. Comes from a plant called bishop's weed. That was developed into a drug called Intal, that was one of the first drugs that was used that suppressed the activity of mast cells in the lungs. Big part of asthma, mast cells explode, release histamines. And that drug was introduced in the 1960s. I was born in 62. That drug gave me a childhood. It meant that I didn't suffer from asthma. You'd take you'd inhale this cromolyn sodium Intal, and it gave me asthma-free years when probably I would have been debilitated. So he's my hero. And this, of course, is all about me this evening. The talk is. What else? That drug's still available. It is used for some asthmatic patients, but now we've got lots and lots of different medicines that are effective treatments for childhood asthma to varying degrees. So, but anyway, this business of self-experimentation is interesting. is interesting. But I don't think anybody experiments on themselves with lethal fungal infections. Ooh. So if our immune system is compromised, and so neutrophils that are normally present and working around in the lungs, macrophages that gobble up fungal cells, are not active, the fungi that we inhale as spores can penetrate our tissues and develop into life-threatening, invasive mycoses, fungal infections. 1.5 million people die globally from fungal infections, which is a much smaller number than we find people dying from bacterial and viral infections, but still 1.5 million, it's a good number. The World Health Organization just last year, I think I've done for an hour. Thank you so much. World Health Organization just last year produced a report then looking at in which they highlighted the most important fungal infections. And so those include things like, and they start in the lung, many of these. So we've got aspergillosis, that also known as farmer's lung, blastomycosis, big outbreak of blastomycosis this summer in Wisconsin among workers in a paper mill. Hundreds of people developing this pretty serious lung infection. Here, histoplasmosis, also known as Ohio Valley disease. So we've all been exposed to this. If your blood work included a test for histoplasmosis, or rather for exposure to histoplasma, and this is actually part of the blood panel that if you join the military, that will be done. Absolutely everybody from this area shows that they've been exposed to this fungus, but most of us never develop any symptoms. In the desert Southwest, we've got coccidioidomycosis, desert valley fever. Well, the list goes on. It's a lot of them. Cryptococcosis, and something that's shown in the exhibition here. So on the picture on the left, this actually comes from Hooke's Micrographia, Robert Hooke, Micrographia, published in London in 1665. We don't have a copy of that here in the Lloyd Library. There is a copy in the rare books collection at the University of Cincinnati. So it needs to be transferred, I think, for the good of humanity, where it can be looked after properly by perhaps a visitor to the library could. It's a very, very valuable book. This is actually the first published illustration of a microorganism, of any microorganism, because Robert Hooke was one of the innovators of microscopy. And so what it shows is a fungus called mucor that's actually growing on a book cover, a sheepskin book cover. And this image is actually reproduced in a book behind me by Steerbeek, also from the 17th century. I'm not sure if it's actually open to that page, but Steerbeek stole images from everybody, and he reproduced Hooke's image. I'm going to get back to infections very shortly. Picture on the right, this comes from Michaeli's Novo Plantarum Genera that was published in Florence in 1729. And that is, don't know where it is. It's in one of the cases here. Wonderful book, incredible. Probably my favorite book on the antiquarian book on fungi. It's Michaeli's work. Carolus Linnaeus hated Micheli, didn't think highly of him, and so it'll probably piss off Dr. Eric Tepe in the room here, who's probably a fan of Linnaeus, but Micheli, he was an experimental scientist and he worked on fungi. Why am I showing you the pictures of these molds? Because you'll find them in your kitchen. They grow on food scraps, moldy bread. They're referred to as bread molds sometimes, often. When our immune system is damaged, there's nothing worse than this. Don't look at this before you go to bed. Don't look at it at all. Don't Google image search mucormycosis. You'll see people whose faces have been digested. This is an awful fungus. Why does it develop as an infectious agent? Since it's everywhere, its spores are everywhere. They're in our kitchens. They're tomatoes. If you leave a tomato out right now, anything from the farmer's market will develop mucor on its surface, little dots you'll see. if we are taking steroidal medicines in high doses to suppress the immune system, mucor can take hold in some rare circumstance. Very rare infection. Nobody needs to worry about this. If you suffer from a severe burn, the fungus can actually get going on the skin because the skin is rendered, unprotected. The immune system's not effective any longer. This points to the nature of fungal infections as opportunistic infections. The fungi are everywhere. We can't avoid them. We interact with them every day from first breath to last gasp. But they don't cause problems until our immune system is impaired in some fashion. So increasingly, the medical study of fungi is actually sort of a branch of immunology. That's where the real action is. Digesting. I think it's the last thing I'll do on the sort of intimate, the inward part of the microbiome in terms of these very close connections. Digesting. So we've got a dining room table of fungi moving through our digestive systems right now. Not that we can feel them. Tens of billions of them. A lot of them are yeasts. Most of them are yeasts. Candida, yeast including Candida albicans, Malassezia that also is found on the scalp and elsewhere on the skin, moving through the gut. We don't know a lot about what they're doing. They're interacting with bacteria. They're probably digesting certain food materials that the bacteria don't get at. They are interacting with our immune system. But this is a frontier in medicine. We don't know a lot about what these fungi are actually doing in the gut. We know that they're there. And there's a huge amount of studies. I mean, every month now, multiple papers coming out on the fungi in the gut and the development of different health conditions. So irritable bowel disease and related issues, Crohn's disease. What else? Clinical obesity, certain forms of cancer, and then even back to asthma. They're all associated with changes in the fungi that we find in the gut. This gets to one of the really important questions in fungal medicine, which is, or one of the challenges, which is distinguishing between cause and effect. Are these changes in the fungi driving disease, or are we developing diseases as we do from other causes? And then this effects a change in the fungal populations. In most cases, we're not sure about this. So this is really developing medicine and something that I believe we should be paying more attention to. But cause and effect relationships, very, very significant part of this. So let's move now, second part of this, from the most intimate connections, so fungi that are growing on and in the body, to our interactions with fungi that are unconscious or conscious that occur in many different ways. Okay, so I'm going to talk about our relationship with fungi as foods, the way that we can be poisoned by fungi as medicinals. I'll treat briefly. Psychoactive fungi. Anyway, those are the topics that I'm going to cover in less than 30 minutes. So, nourishing. Well, you tell me here. Fermented foods that you have consumed that are fermented by fungi, maybe things that aren't shown on the picture here. So we've got blue cheese, bread that's leavened by yeast, Saccharomyces cerevisiae, soy sauce that's actually made by two different species of filamentous fungi, species of Aspergillus, fungal product. We've got wine, of course, fermented by Saccharomyces cerevisiae. Tempeh, Indonesian originally food. That's this block of soy, and it's sort of it's got this interwoven fungal mycelium that's in there, or colony. Mycelium is the name for a fungal colony. And then also preserved meats, or rather these salami. Salami has its own fungus, its whole series of fungi that just grow on salami and that change the flavor of the fungi, extract water from the meat to increase its shelf life. What else? Anybody else eaten anybody eaten fungal products that are not listed up here? Perhaps sauerkraut. So fungi absolutely involved in sauerkraut. Also a lot of bacteria Yes, kombucha. A lot of different fungi there. Amazing. That's a whole teeming ecosystem of microorganisms there in kombucha. Yeah, absolutely. And a different yeast from the one that is involved in alcoholic fermentation. Kimchi, fantastic. There are studies in the fungal journals now. Somebody will take a jar of kimchi and actually they'll carry out this elaborate genetic analysis of everything that's in kimchi, and they'll find all of these fungi. It's incredible. Kimchi, chocolate is another one that's fermented. Coffee beans, they interact with fungi early in their processing. Buttermilk, I think lactic acid bacteria. I'm not sure if there are fungi involved, but there may well be. Probably are. Sour cream, bacterial product. Probably something like yogurt too is most. It's lactic acid bacteria in yogurts, but sometimes the fungi are in there too.
What about the mistaken ingestion of ergot?
Of ergot? We're going to come to that.
Okay.
We're going to come to ergot and poisoning shortly. There are some really awful fermented fungal products that, nevertheless, I'd like to try, I suppose, for my edification. There's rotting shark meat that's a delicacy in Iceland. You might have seen this on one of the food programs on television. Hakal, that's called. Apparently, tastes and smells how you'd know of urine. I mean, why you would,
It's poisonous fresh.
Because it's it's poisonous fresh, and so it wasn't developed for the loveliness of its flavor, but rather as a survival, technique for these Scandinavians that were eating this. There's actually a lot of these awful products in Scandinavia, but I'll have to go up there with some antacids and so forth. And we've been eating these things for a long time. So travel with me to a salt mine in Austria, and let's look at some paleo feces. The feces left by Iron Age salt miners has been studied genetically, and they found some deposit by an Iron Age salt miner that contained traces of the fungus that's involved in blue cheese fermentation. So it's Penicillium roqueforti. This thing, you don't acquire this thing in nature. There's just not enough of it around. He must have actually been eating blue cheese. We know what he ate. We know that he was drinking beer too. Absolutely fascinating. So we've been interacting with fungi. This was a salt miner. He knew nothing about the fungi, but he enjoyed blue cheese, or he ate it anyway. Fascinating. So we've been doing this forever, and I'm going to show you some examples, or very shortly, of how this is evolving. Incidentally, while I'm talking about yeast, very, very important to the US economy. Our GDP now is north of $20 trillion. $1 trillion of that is based on the activities of one fungus, Saccharomyces cerevisiae. If we look at brewing and baking, also throw in bioethanol, it's produced by as a yeast product. It's worth more than the US automobile industry, our interactions with one yeast. If you are diabetic, insulin dependent, suffer from insulin dependent diabetes, the insulin that you're injecting is quite likely to be actually produced by yeast. So we genetically transformed yeast to produce human insulin. That's the Novo Nordisk product. Eli Lilly, they use a bacterial platform for producing, but they just the sheer multitude and diversity of these interactions with fungi is just amazing. I hope you've all eaten this corn product in every Kroger store in the freezer case. It's good stuff. If you eat the chicken nuggets, they taste pretty good, especially with whatever you put on chicken nuggets. And here's my shout out for chickens. So my wife and I have chickens in Oxford, Ohio. We love them as pets. We shouldn't be turning them into chicken nuggets. We shouldn't be making them suffer to produce a form of protein that's so tasteless. I mean, what we taste in a chicken nugget is mostly the breading and the added fat. So we could do this, and there's other forms of mycoprotein, fungal protein, that work well. Okay, so I'm a spokesperson for Quorn. This is the corn fungus. It's a thing called Fusarium, and it's fermented in these gigantic fermenters. The technology was developed in the United Kingdom, but it's now been licensed globally. The individual fermenters are up to 50 meters high. In a single run, they'll produce, I have to look down at this, is that true? 1,500 tons of corn in a single run. And the corn fungus is fed by, you can see it says glucose syrup that's shoved into the fermenter. That's actually produced by another fungus. So we use an aspergillus, another mold, and the enzymes that it generates to take cornstarch and produce corn syrup. And that's what is fed into the fermenters. So we have a fungus feeding a fungus that feeds us if you eat corn. Ta-da! And let's talk about the glories of Cincinnati again. But first of all, travel with me to South San Francisco. If you drive into the city of South San Francisco, there's a board there. There's a marker. There's a sign that says the birthplace of biotechnology, 1976. And that's because Genentech was established there in South San Francisco. How about let's look elsewhere? Cincinnati is the birthplace of biotechnology. If you drive along River Road and you pass the Riverside Ballpark before you get to downtown, that was the site of the original Fleischmann yeast plant, where they developed the first yeast plant that developed these compressed cakes of yeast that were used for baking. That's the birthplace. I mean, why we don't have, there's no marker there. We have to put a historical marker there and say, this is the birthplace of biotechnology. But then I can hear an Anglophile in the audience that says, what about Marlow Bottom? Marlow Bottom, what about it? It's a town, it's a village. That's where this was discovered in a compost heap in the 1970s, around the time that Genentech was developed. And that's what became corn. So I expect Marlow Bottom can say the birthplace of biotechnology, but I'm going to go with Cincinnati. I'll go with my adopted home. Treating medicinals. Otzi the Iceman, he died 5,000 years ago. And what? He carried a bag that contained little beads of a fungus called the birch polypore. You ever go up to the UP, Upper Peninsula of Michigan, and you walk through the birch forests around the Great Lakes there? You'll see this fungus on a lot of birch trees. It's epidemic, and it's on lots of birch trees. It's a pathogen. It kills the birch trees. It degrades the wood of the birch tree. So why was Otzi carrying these? Well, when they discovered these fungal beads strung on rawhide in a little pouch, there was a paper published in The Lancet in which an anthropologist claimed that the fungus was used as a medicinal for treating worm infections, and that Otzi had used this to treat his infestation in his gut, because they had found the eggs of some nematodes, some roundworms in his gut, but there is no evidence whatsoever that this fungus is a useful treatment for worm infestation. Okay, and this wishful thinking, we don't know what Otzi was doing with this. We don't know why he carried it. And the problem is, I think that this wishful thinking actually permeates the literature on medicinal mushrooms. And one of the many things that's made me tremendously unpopular is a paper that I wrote that was published in 2016 called "Are Mushrooms Medicinal?" ? It was published in the journal Fungal Biology. It remains the most downloaded article in that journal's history. And every month on month, more copies that are downloaded, and I get hate mail. So all I was saying was, show me the evidence. Just show me the evidence for a clinical effect of these fungi. I've got my own maxim here, which is a cure alleged for everything is an effective treatment for nothing. I should go in the Oxford Dictionary of Quotations. A curative for everything is an effective treatment for nothing. And if you get online, you'll find that the birch polypore can treat any ailment that you can imagine. But the evidence is lacking. Yet it has been used in traditional medical practices for probably millennia, certainly centuries. It acts as a styptic. So you can take pieces of this and it will actually staunch bleeding, localized bleeding. And so there's things like this where these fungi do have these activities, but they haven't been scrutinized using modern placebo-controlled, double-blinded trials, which we need to do. I guess so. Go for it.
I just wanted to add, I mean, I know you're talking about this, but they weren't doing peer-reviewed journals back in, folklore.
That's right. You're right.
I mean, and the study of the different families of fungi are probably still lacking right now. But I think there's a lot of evidence that they were used in
Absolutely.
literature.
That's where indeed there is evidence there in the use of these fungi in traditional medical practices. But if we're going to introduce these into the modern marketplace, as many companies are doing, I want some evidence before I accept that these compounds are useful. And if you do read the essay that you'll find on my website, themycologist.com, if you want to look at it there, I think I lay out my argument. It's an unbeatable argument. But we can go back to this. We can go back to this in the Q&A. However, I'll end on this because this could be, we do the whole talk about medicinals. I actually think that the future for fungal medicine is really bright, and in medicinal mushrooms, for the following reason. I mean, this is an example. So we can look at a bird's nest fungi, these little fungi that produce these cups from which these are spore-filled capsules that get splashed into the air. I've studied these for many years, looking at the mechanics of this process. These bird's nest fungi produce an incredible array of antibiotics that have these powerful antibacterial effects. There's a lot of literature on this, but as far as I know, that work hasn't been driven into clinical trials at this point. The fungi are probably filled with pharmacologically active compounds, but often we're left at sort of a case of buyer beware. We're left at a lot of wishful thinking about the way that these things can act and be used to treat very, very serious ailments, immunological disorders and cancer and so forth. And that's what I wanted to say about that project. By the way, with Otzi's fungus, in the Smithsonian, there are these photographs of Native Americans, Plains Indians, and they're wearing fungal beads. It's not really clear here, but they've got them on these ceremonial robes in the top. There's actually a rhythm beads that are actually around a halter around the neck of this horse here. They clearly were imbued with a lot of spiritual significance. Otzi may have carried this for religious purposes, for spiritual purposes, rather than using them as a medicinal. I think there's just too much wishful thinking in this area of mycology. A few other topics, and then we'll go to a rich question and answer session, perhaps. Poisoning. We're poisoned by some fungi. You probably read about the recent cases of deliberate poisoning. Was that in Australia? Somebody that poisoned her. I don't know who she poisoned. Dinner guests. Sorry?
In-laws.
In-laws. Well, there you go. Who would have thought, well, at least she had a purpose there, right? Kill your in-laws. I mean, we haven't sort of seen the Romans were big on this in the Roman Empire, of course, and I know right now this has actually been, I can see on my screen that this has been hacked this evening, and Vladimir Putin appears to be watching. So, in addition to being pushed out of windows, watch out for mushrooms. Vladimir, thank you for inviting me for dinner. These interactions with poisonous mushrooms, part of the reason that fungi are so closely associated with witchcraft and the ergot fungus. So this fungus produces potent compounds, including, well, they're called the ergot alkaloids. It's a whole family of these compounds. And if you eat bread that's been made from ergot-infected rye flour, as they did in medieval Europe. All hell breaks loose. St. Anthony's fire. So this painting is actually based on Bosch, but it's actually a clearer. In this vignette is actually clearer than in Bosch. You can see there's a village that's burning in the background, and that refers to the Ignis Sacer, the holy fire, the feeling of burning that would happen when through vasoconstriction. And then there's this Magus at the bottom, wearing the top hat, and he's staring at a pictograph of a severed foot. And indeed, in medieval times, feet were actually seceded, were broken from the body. There's all kinds of motifs in this picture that relate to the symptoms of holy fire, St. Anthony's fire. Couple more topics. Also, the association with witchcraft relates to the psychoactive properties of hundreds of species of psilocybe, and other fungi. Of course, this is one of the big topics right now in fungal medicine, is the use of mushrooms that contain psilocybin, or rather the use of psilocybin purified from mushrooms to treat cases of recalcitrant, severe clinical depression that hasn't responded to other medicines. What else have I seen? PTSD, all kinds of disorders that appear to be responding well to treatment with psilocybin. Psilocybin, when we ingest the mushroom or pure psilocybin, it's converted to a molecule called psilocin, and psilocin is a mimic for serotonin, and so it has profound effects upon our nervous system. And I'm not going to get into this in this presentation. I just wanted to mention that this is a fascinating area of fungal medicine. I read a recent paper on this that was looking at the actual how one might describe the effects of psilocybin on the nervous system, and there was a good degree of correspondence between psilocybin use and the phenomenon of lucid dreaming, which is really interesting. There's a lot more to this, but I mean, if you think about the most interesting, if you've ever had I used to have lucid dreams as a young man. I don't have them now, but I can remember some of those dreams to this day, and they're profoundly consciousness changing experience. What about the relationship with these fungi and religion? So this is a claim that was made back in the 1970s. A guy called Allegro and others picked up on this, was the idea that we can look at the roots of a religion, Christianity in particular, and say that there's some relationship here between the use of mushrooms, psychedelic mushrooms, and the development of those faiths, which is really interesting. And in one of those early books, this image was shown. It's a very famous image, the best one that I can find anywhere here, this photograph. And it's of a wall painting, medieval wall painting from Planquereau Chapel in central France that shows what? It's a bit vague, isn't it? So we've got the tree of knowledge in the middle, and there's a serpent you can maybe see that's wound around the stem of this structure, and it's holding the forbidden fruit toward Eve, and then Adam is standing there doing nothing, as Adam did. Of man's first disobedience and the fruit of that forbidden tree, whose mortal taste brought death into the world and all our woe, till one greater man restore the blissful seat. Sing Heavenly Muse. Paradise Lost, if you haven't read it. It's good stuff. So it was claimed back in the 70s, and Gordon Wasson became involved in this too. It's a very interesting story. Many of you will have heard of Wasson, and we got some of Wasson's works in the exhibition here. But this wasn't this was the tree of knowledge, but it was actually a fungal tree. It was a tree of fly agaric mushrooms. And I looked at this in various ways. I actually went there on a road trip years ago. We're in the Loire Valley, and I looked on the map, and so it's not that far. Drove for hours and hours, and I couldn't get in there. It was locked. There was a phone number, and my French is crap. I went to a local farmhouse, and a dog barked at me, and a guy came out with a shotgun, and so I never got. I was right there. My wife and I were right. We'd driven for miles and miles, so I've never been there. I've never seen it in person, but I was skeptical about it. You know, it could be an umbrella pine. But there's been a lot more scholarship in this area in the last few years that's really compelling. So if we look at other wall paintings and other works of art in Europe, a lot of these wall paintings on churches that were, it was the time of the Crusades, of course, spread over many centuries. So Saint-Martin de Vic here, what is going on the right there? Is that the tree of knowledge there with the forbidden? Maybe there's a serpent, there's something wound around it. What's this monk doing? He appears to be slicing it with a knife. And then if we also in the same church, there's this picture of the Last Supper. And if you look at under the table at the robes worn by the apostles, there appear to be all these mushrooms that are there. And you can say it's just a fold in the garments they're wearing. And then it just gets more and more elaborate. Look at this one here. Different abbey, 11th to 12th century. Those must be mushrooms. I don't know what to make of this. I still don't. But I've sort of got more respect now for some of those early works by the psychonauts that were looking at these origins of religion. It's difficult to say that mushrooms, or I would say that mushrooms are intertwined with the origin of Christianity, of monotheism. I don't know how, but these were put there for a purpose in these wall paintings, and the celebrants, the parishioners would have seen these. Wow. Needs to be more work in this area. Before I move on from hallucinogenics, though, so this is when I close my eyes, this is what I see. My life is a dream. It's perfect. I don't need anything. It's like this. Patricia, director of the Lloyd, and I have talked about this briefly. So there's so much interest in psychedelics right now, and psychedelic mushrooms, that are we going to soon legalize them in the state of Ohio? Obviously, they're legal in Oregon, and they're becoming legal elsewhere, Colorado. Is this something that we're moving towards? But is this something clearly in the treatment of severe depression? If they're helpful, this is fantastic. But is this something that all of us should be working towards? I don't know what feeling like this is like, but feeling like this, I don't know. We evolved to be unhappy. There's a reason that humans are essentially a bit unhappy most of the time. Now, I'm not talking about depression, and I mean no disrespect whatsoever. But for those of us that are fortunate enough not to suffer from depression, we're supposed to feel kind of unhappy most of the time. And the reason is that makes us acquisitive. Evolution has driven this. Natural selection has driven this for us to be, if we were happy, we'd sit around and be happy, right? We wouldn't do stuff. We wouldn't go out to work. We wouldn't work for Procter & Gamble. We wouldn't work for Miami University. We wouldn't work hard. We're supposed to be acquisitive. I mean, if you think there's any meaning in life. So I don't know. I'm very against everything. I'm against legalizing anything. Take it away. Prohibition is the way to go. Being a little bit unhappy, okay? And then the better moments are better moments. That's my therapy. There we go. I'd be the world's worst therapist, wouldn't I? And I'm an educator. Students come into my office. No, you're supposed to be unhappy. Last thing. The greatest extension of so we've been looking here at the extension of the mycobiome, our interactions with fungi, and looking here at, the use of hallucinogenic mushroom. It's an extension of the mycobiome. It's now a deliberate use. Well, it's always been a deliberate use of the fungi for changing our consciousness. But the greatest extension is all around us in nature, and it's through the ecological role of the fungi as the great recyclers, the ones that spin the carbon cycle. Fungi break down the tissues produced by other organisms, and if it weren't for this, the carbon cycle would not run. We are totally dependent upon the activities of the fungi, and we can think about here mycorrhizal fungi, a lot in the news in the last few years, and these supportive relationships between fungi and forest trees. Again, forest health is dependent upon the activities of the fungi. Health of the fungi is dependent upon the trees. Beautiful example of a mutualistic symbiosis. So we are absolutely dependent upon the fungi, both those that are growing in the body and on us. And if you ever, I got to a point in my life a few years ago where I just got fed up with working on the fungi. This is a number of now a very late midlife crisis. I turned 60 last year, as I was admitting to my friend Eric, who said, "There's no way you look like you're in your 30s." So, but anyway, we all go through changes. I was thinking, I'm done with the fungi. I've studied them since I was in college and undergraduate. I want to do something else. And I actually started to do research on amoebas, which interests me too. And then I made the mistake of going to New Zealand, where I had a horrible trip. We arrived during an earthquake, and then there was a fire in the hotel. We were evacuated from the hotel. Nothing worked on that trip. But on the way back, my wife and I were celebrating it was our 1000th wedding anniversary. We stopped in the Fijian Islands. And Fiji's really hot right now, temperature-wise, hotter than even here. And you've got to get up before sunrise if you want to go on a hike and get up into the highlands, which I did one morning. And so picture this, I'm beginning to think not going to work on fungi anymore. And then I took out my iPhone, it's beautiful sunrise. And then a couple of seconds later, the next shot I took was this, and I fell to my knees. It is indeed, it's all about mushrooms. It just is. I was convinced. I was being told this.
That's a message.
And I forgot to plug my products here. There's a copy of the paperback copies of my book Mushrooms that was published the paperback just came out this year. One of the great selling points of this book, it's available for sale here in the Lloyd. I think it's $70 or $80 a copy, I think, isn't it? But many of the color images in the book come from the collection and are represented here in the display today. And then in March next year, I've written this book about the peer-reviewed medicine. This will sell about 6 copies, but it's produced by Princeton University Press. This was my pandemic project, and it's finally come to fruition, and it'll be out in the spring. And it's about these interactions with the fungi, all the way from the fungi that live in the gut to our interactions with the fungi. And there's a lot of topics that I didn't talk about, but thank you. That's an hour. Thank you for your time.
Any questions for?
The gentleman here.
You were saying there was not much involved in medicine, but penicillium.
I didn't, and that was, I beg your pardon with that. So the gentleman here was saying that I messed up big time, and I certainly did. I messed up big time, I admit that. I didn't talk about the fungal medicines. I did mention insulin that was produced by genetically modified yeast, but of course we've got penicillium and other antibiotics that are produced by filamentous fungi. We have cyclosporin, that's a fungal product. There are many, many life-saving medicines that are produced by fungi. And now that we're working with genetically modified fungi, an increasing number of medicines. There's this acroplasmin that's used for treating age-related damage to the eye. All kinds of products that are being introduced that are produced by fungi. So yeah, thank you for pointing that out. Antibiotics, of course, rich history of. Yeah.
So Taxol is a anti-cancer drug that's it's an endophytic relationship with the taxus tree.
Use, yeah.
I know that actually is another source of fungal medicine.
Yeah, that's a good point. Although the Taxol that's used is actually the stuff that's produced by yews, I believe. And there's a lot of interest in actually how much the fungus is actually contributing to this. But there's some really interesting genetics that went on in the evolution there in terms of the transfer of the genes that actually are involved in Taxol production. But yeah, that's a good call. Taxol, very important in breast cancer treatment.
I have something that I can add to that too. First, we have a little, I don't know if you've seen the display back here about the inventors of Taxol. One of our speakers that's going to be doing a webinar is Nicholas Overlees, and on November 1, and it's fungi as a source of drug discoveries. He worked with the person, as an undergraduate and then a PhD student that discovered Taxol. And I met with him this summer, and he was telling me that they are learning more and more about the microbes in the Taxol. So definitely sign up for that lecture. And that is really breaking news, apparently.
Very cool. Other thoughts? Yes.
So you mentioned that for some mushrooms, there's not good pharmacological evidence of their effectiveness as medicines. So I wondered if there is a growing body of research on the epigenetic effects of mushroom consumption that might be a way that might not corroborate, but
Right.
that might align more closely with
So
medicinal traditions about mushroom consumption and their medical effectiveness.
So the best work in that area is being done, and it's looking at compounds called beta-glucans that are present in the cell walls of really all fungi. And there have been clinical trials performed on these purified beta-glucans. They come from the cell wall of fungi. And their effects, and they're being actually looked at, their efficacy in treating cancer. So some of this work is going on, but in terms of real, results that are showing real efficacy, we're not there yet. I mean, I get upset when I look online. Some of the companies will look at, there's so much to this topic, but when you're talking about treating particular diseases with fungi, and the claim is made that they actually they enhance the immune response. I mean, we need more specifics. It's a very broad topic. But yeah, I'm very skeptical because those studies have not been done. And yet, as the gentleman at the back said, we've clearly got this rich history of using fungi in traditional medical practices to treat many different conditions. And so that's fascinating. One would think that they have some effect. I mean, some of this is due to the essential mismatch between what traditional Chinese medicine and modern Western medicine, that we just, the philosophical basis for for medicine in traditional Chinese medicine, modern medicine, very different. It's like we're speaking a different language. I don't know how we overcome that.
I have one last example. Ergot, like the fungi on the grain, that is used as a like a migraine medicine.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's also used too. So ergotamine too, and it's also been used to treat to staunch bleeding after childbirth and so forth. Again, this is very strong vasoconstricting effects. It's a similar effect on migraine headaches too, just to shrink the blood vessels. Yeah, very powerful medicines. Yeah.
At one point, I don't know if this still exists, the NIH had an office of alternative medicines that was supposed to start working and do these tests and trials like the traditional medicine.
Yeah.
That's not happening anymore, or is that...
I honestly don't know the answer to that. I don't believe so. I haven't heard anything about the NIH. I was aware of this program. I haven't heard anything about it lately, so that makes me think that this isn't continuing. But
So
I don't know.
I also want to just refer again to Nicholas Overlees. He does a lot of work with NIH, and they don't call it alternative medicine because it really is an alternative like Taxol. It's a compound, but that originally comes from nature. So there are folks at the NIH and divisions of the NIH that are looking at nature-based medicine. I don't know if that's the same or different than what you're talking about.
Interesting.
I will not stick long. You can go ahead.
Off the pharmacological track that we're taking, can you explain, or I'm just curious about what happens to fungi after a burn event like the one in Hawaii where temperatures reach 2,000 degrees?
That's a great question. So there are fungi, including the morels that we see in this region. Out west, you'll actually see that morels will proliferate after a burn. That this is a natural process then. So there's a lot of decomposing wood, root material after or the above ground parts of the plant. And that this seems to stimulate the fruiting of the morels. I wonder though, with things like the severity of that fire in Hawaii, whether this was so damaging that whether you're going to actually see some kind of sort of fungal proliferation afterwards. I don't know the answer to that. Yeah, it's a good question. Yeah, some of these events are so catastrophic and the temperatures that are reached are so high. I wonder whether anything, or even a fungal mycelium, would survive in the soil. Yeah, good question. Yeah, all right.
So the neural after the fire, you know if they're mycelia that survive in the soil or if they're spores that blow in afterwards. I mean, it sounds like spores are everywhere at all times.
It would probably be that an established colony or mycelium in the soil that's interacting with, so there is this sort of partial mycorrhizal relationship there. They're interacting with the trees. The trees are then burned in this event and they're fruiting. I mean, in a sense, you could look upon this as they've lost their healthy host. It's time to get out of here. You know, it's time to move quickly. I mean, that's what a mushroom is. It's a sex organ for producing clouds of spores. Let's fruit and get out of here. It's being anthropomorphic. Yeah. Yes.
So I don't have quite the language for this, but those spores are everywhere. And is that dependent on the weather and the soil in that region?
Yeah, absolutely. So we'll see. In fact, if you watch the nightly news, still on the longer weather forecast, but certainly if you look online, they'll look at pollen counts and spore counts. So we measure that around here. There's a major counting station in Dayton, and they'll look at the way that the concentration of spores in the air changes seasonally. And so if you are asthmatic and you are likely to respond to those spores, yeah, this is an indication that these conditions are likely to exacerbate your asthma symptoms. So yeah, but they change seasonally. The fungi are growing in soil, they're growing on scraps of vegetation, they're growing on plants, but certainly at different times of the year, we see an increase in the number of spores in the air. Yeah. Yes.
This is kind of a question for my own edification. I know that there have been several documented cases of Schizophilum commune infecting lung tissue of immune-compromised patients where they've actually found hyphae growing within the lung tissue. I swear several years ago that I read one documented case of an immunocompromised cancer patient where they actually found a fruit body growing inside her lungs.
And that's true. Although it was actually in the nasal cavities, and there have been some patients. And the weird thing, a couple of those cases have actually been in apparently healthy young men. So their immune systems weren't damaged, but they'd show up with actual fungal growth in such that they were smelling a sort of fungal smell all the time. And the fungus was actually fruiting in their nasal cavities. This is apparently documented.
Do you have any tips to get me to those case studies?
If I'll give you my card, if you email me, I'll find you some references to them. But whenever there's an unusual fungal infection, some clinician is going to describe it and publish it somewhere. So yeah, in fact, there was a fairly recent review article on Schizophilum or Schizophyllum communi. It's a fungus that grows everywhere, but it shows up in a tiny number of patients as a serious infection, usually in the nasal in the nares in those. So there's a big review article on that recently. But even some of the mushrooms that you see fruiting on mulch around here will show up from time to time growing in human tissues, usually in people whose immune systems are damaged, but not always, which is, hideous.
There's supposed to be some types of fungus that aren't able to grow inside of the human body because of the temperature of the human body.
So that's one of the ideas about the increase in fungal infections that we are seeing in some places, is that climate change has actually pushed fungi to be capable of growing at higher temperatures, including those in our bodies. I don't subscribe to that idea because I think that these other more important ecological effects. In fact, there's a lot of fungi, Schizophyllum is one of them. It can grow at human body temperature. There's other things that are preventing that from growing in us right now. But yeah, it's a good question. There's a lot of interest in that. In the idea is that human body temperature may have evolved as our higher body temperature to actually exclude microorganisms, including fungi. Yeah, very interesting. Yeah.
It seems like more people eat more mushrooms now than in any other time. And how does that affect our human bodies, or does it?
So there are some that believe that eating mushrooms every day is really good for our health and well-being, but the evidence for that is quite limited. One thing that we're doing when we eat mushrooms is that we're not eating bacon and things like that, which is good. So I think it's often it's eating mushrooms to the exclusion of bacon. That's my hypothesis, but it depends on how much you're actually eating too. So, but you're absolutely right. There's more interest in mushrooms. Also, mushrooms are extremely low in calories. Truffles are the exception to that. But mushrooms it's mostly water and a couple of forms of fiber that are in a mushroom. So we eat them for their texture and their flavor. But in terms of nobody can survive on mushrooms in the woods. Just not enough energetic value to them. Yeah, good question.
Thank you for joining us. Our programs are supported in part by the members of the Lloyd Library. If you would like to contribute to these programs, visit our website at lloydlibrary.org. We hope to see you next time.